It was just another ordinary day for Daniel West, a quiet 12-year-old boy who sat near the back of the courtroom. The room was large and echoing, filled with the sound of people moving and papers shuffling. He had been here many times before, but every day felt the same. The walls seemed to close in around him, making him feel even smaller than he already was. His clothes were simple, nothing fancy, and he didn't stand out in the crowd. He wasn't noticed much by anyone, not by the lawyers, not by the judge, and certainly not by the powerful people sitting in the front row. Daniel wasn't the type of boy who spoke up in class, and he wasn't the one to raise his hand for attention. His hair was messy, and his face had that look of someone who didn't want to be seen. He wasn't a troublemaker, but he wasn't a hero either. He wasn't the one everyone turned to for answers or advice. He sat quietly, like he was just another face in the crowd, invisible to the people around him. It seemed like Daniel was always overlooked. People often looked right past him, as if he didn't matter. Even in a room full of people, like the courtroom where his father's trial was taking place, Daniel felt like he was alone. It wasn't that anyone was being rude on purpose, it was just the way people were. Everyone was so busy with their own lives, their own problems, and their own work that they didn't have time to notice a quiet boy sitting in the back of the room. But what people didn't know was that Daniel had a secret. And it wasn't the kind of secret that made him nervous or scared. No, this secret was something that could change everything. Something that could change the entire trial. It was a secret so important that, if it was revealed at the right time, it could turn the case upside down. The trial was about his father. Daniel's father, Jason West, had been accused of a crime he didn't commit. It was a serious charge, one that could send him to prison for many years. Everyone in the courtroom, from the judge to the lawyers to the people in the gallery, thought they knew how it would end. They thought Jason West was guilty. They thought the case was already decided. But Daniel knew something they didn't. Something that could prove his father's innocence. Daniel didn't look like someone who could change anything. After all, he was just a kid. What did he know about courtrooms, lawyers, or justice? He didn't have the experience, the knowledge, or the power that the grown ups in the room had. But what they didn't know was that Daniel had been paying close attention. He had been watching, listening, and quietly collecting pieces of information that no one else had noticed. Every little detail he saw and heard added up, forming a picture that could save his father. Daniel wasn't just sitting in the courtroom to watch his father's trial. He had a purpose. His heart was heavy with the weight of that purpose. But there was something about the way the adults around him acted, like they had already made up their minds, that made him feel invisible. The lawyers didn't ask him for help. The judge didn't look at him twice. And the people in the front row, the ones with all the power and influence, paid him no attention at all. But Daniel wasn't upset. He wasn't angry. He had learned a long time ago that being ignored was part of life. He had accepted it. The trial had been going on for weeks now. Every day, Daniel came to court, sat in the back, and listened. He watched as his father's lawyer did his best to defend him, but it wasn't enough. It seemed like everyone believed his father was guilty. They didn't want to hear anything different. The prosecutor, the lawyer who argued against his father, was loud and confident. He spoke with authority, and his words were sharp. He painted a picture of Jason West as a man who was guilty of a terrible crime, and no one seemed to question it. At first, Daniel didn't know what to do. He was just a boy, after all. What could he possibly do to change the way everyone saw his father's case? But as the days passed, he began to notice things. Small things that no one else seemed to notice. A look here, a gesture there. Little details that seemed out of place. The more he watched, the more he realized something important. This case wasn't as clear-cut as everyone thought. Daniel had learned from his father to always look for the truth. His father had taught him that truth was important, and it didn't matter how old you were, or how small you were, or how invisible you felt, truth had a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter what. And that's what Daniel believed. He believed that the truth would come out. He just didn't know how, or when, it would happen. So, there he sat, in the back of the courtroom, trying to stay calm, trying to stay quiet. He watched his father, who looked tired but determined. Jason West had always been a man of integrity, and it hurt him to see the lies being told about him. Daniel knew his father didn't deserve to be there, but he couldn't figure out how to prove it. He had to find a way. The judge, a woman named Judge Richardson, was strict but fair. She didn't smile much, and her glasses often slid down her nose as she looked over the papers in front of her. She listened carefully to both sides of the argument, but her face was hard to read. Daniel didn't know if she was kind or harsh, if she cared about the truth or just wanted to get the trial over with. But he knew that if he was going to do anything, it had to be soon. Time was running out, and his father's fate was hanging in the balance. Every day, Daniel tried to think of something he could do. But what? What could a 12-year-old boy possibly do to change the course of a trial? He didn't have the power to speak in court. He didn't have the power to stand up and demand justice. He didn't even have the power to talk to the lawyers. They were all busy, all too focused on the case to pay attention to him. But Daniel wasn't just going to sit there and do nothing. He had learned to be patient. He had learned that sometimes, you had to wait for the right moment. And he was waiting. Waiting for the perfect moment to reveal his secret. A secret that could change everything. It wasn't much longer before that moment came. As Daniel sat quietly, he began to notice the way the lawyer for his father, Mr. Harris, was struggling. Mr. Harris was an older man, with gray hair and glasses that always seemed to be slipping off his nose. He wasn't a bad lawyer, but he seemed tired. It wasn't that he didn't care about Daniel's father, but it felt like he was giving up. The arguments he made in court were weak, and he didn't have the fire in his eyes like the prosecutor did. Daniel felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He could see it in the way the prosecutor, Mr. Richards, spoke. He was confident, even arrogant. He smiled whenever he made a point, as if he knew that the trial was going his way. His voice was loud and strong, and he always seemed to have a way of turning the truth into something that sounded very much like a lie. Daniel didn't like Mr. Richards. He could see right through him. But it wasn't just the lawyers who bothered Daniel. It was the way the judge, Judge Richardson, kept looking at the case. She wasn't cruel, but Daniel could tell she was growing impatient. She had heard the same arguments over and over again. There was only so much she could listen to before she made up her mind. And Daniel knew that if she made up her mind, his father would lose. His father didn't deserve to lose. Daniel knew that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the case against his father, it was everything. Something about the way people were talking, the way the papers had been written, just didn't add up. Daniel had learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts told him that there was more to this case than anyone realized. He thought about his father. Jason West wasn't a criminal. He was a hard-working man, someone who always did the right thing. He had taught Daniel to be honest, to always tell the truth, no matter what. Daniel had grown up with his father's strong sense of justice. His father had shown him that truth was the most important thing in the world. But now, in this courtroom, it felt like the truth didn't matter. It was hard to understand. Daniel had heard the stories about how his father had been accused of stealing money from the company he worked for. But Daniel didn't believe it. He couldn't believe it. His father had always been a man of honor. He would never steal, never cheat, never do anything to hurt anyone. But everyone else seemed to think otherwise. The prosecutor, the judge, even the people in the courtroom, all of them seemed to believe that his father was guilty. And Daniel couldn't understand why. That's when Daniel began to notice something strange. As the days passed and the trial continued, he started to see small things. Little details that didn't make sense. It was the way the prosecutor, Mr. Richards, seemed to know exactly what was going to happen next. He always had an answer, always had a reason to explain why things were going his way. Daniel had learned to pay attention to the small things, and he knew that something wasn't right about Mr. Richards. Daniel started to think about the evidence the prosecution had presented. It was all circumstantial. There was no hard proof that his father had stolen the money. But still, everyone believed the prosecutor's story. Daniel wondered how they could be so sure. How could they ignore the fact that there was no real evidence? Why did they believe the lies? Every day, Daniel listened carefully to the trial, paying attention to everything that was said. He didn't understand all of it, but he understood enough to know that something was wrong. And as the days went by, Daniel's suspicion grew. He knew there was something hidden, something that no one else could see. It was like a puzzle, with pieces scattered everywhere, and Daniel was determined to put those pieces together. Daniel had always been good at solving puzzles. When he was younger, he loved putting together jigsaw puzzles. It didn't matter how difficult the puzzle was, he never gave up until it was finished. And this trial, this case, was just another puzzle to him. He knew that if he could just find the right piece, everything would fall into place. One afternoon, as the trial dragged on, Daniel was sitting in his usual spot at the back of the courtroom. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the people in the front. They all seemed so serious, so focused on the case. No one was paying attention to him. No one cared about the boy sitting in the back. But that's when he saw it. A notebook. It wasn't on the table where it should have been. It was tucked under the edge of a chair, almost hidden from view. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced. The notebook looked important. Maybe it was just a random notebook that someone had forgotten, but Daniel knew better than to think it was just a mistake. This was no accident. He waited for the right moment, keeping his eyes on the notebook. He had to be careful. If someone saw him getting up to look at it, they would know something was wrong. But Daniel was smart. He knew how to be sneaky when he needed to be. When the court took a short break, Daniel quickly got up from his seat. He moved silently, careful not to attract attention. He made his way to the chair where the notebook was hidden, and without hesitation, he reached out and grabbed it. His hands shook slightly as he opened the notebook. The pages were filled with notes, scribbled ideas, numbers, names. It didn't make sense at first, but Daniel was used to figuring things out. He flipped through the pages, scanning them quickly. And then he found it. A name. A name that didn't belong. A name Daniel had never heard before, but it was written in the middle of a page with a big red circle around it. Daniel's eyes widened. He didn't know who this person was, but he could tell it was important. He could feel it in his gut. There was something more here, something that no one else had noticed. Daniel knew it. He had to figure out what this name meant and what it had to do with the case. But how? He couldn't just walk up to his father's lawyer and tell him about it. He couldn't trust anyone else in the courtroom. Daniel had to keep the secret for now. But he knew one thing for sure, this notebook held the answers. And when the time was right, he would reveal them. Daniel's world had always been one of shadows. The corners of his life were dark, like a room without light. His parents, always struggling to keep their heads above water, had never been able to give him the attention he craved. His mother worked long hours as a waitress, always tired and worn out, and his father, Jason, had been caught up in his own troubles ever since the accusations started. They were a family that barely had enough money to keep the lights on, much less the time or energy to be there for each other. Daniel knew that their love was real, but it was buried under the weight of too many problems. They were too busy trying to survive. At school, things weren't any better. Daniel was ignored. No one paid attention to him, and no one really cared about what he thought or how he felt. His classmates didn't know how hard he tried, how he stayed up late reading books and learning, or how he practiced being brave in his own quiet way. They only saw a shy boy with messy hair, sitting alone in the back of the classroom, staring out the window. They didn't know what was in his mind, and they didn't want to. They just called him nobody's son, a name that hurt Daniel every time he heard it. It was as though they believed his father's troubles made him less of a person. His father had been accused of something terrible, and that made Daniel feel like an outsider in his own life. The kids didn't understand the gravity of the situation. They didn't know that their words stung deeply, like knives in his heart. They didn't know how he spent every night thinking about how his father was sitting in a courtroom, fighting for his freedom, while Daniel was stuck in school, invisible to everyone. The mocking words of his classmates echoed in his mind as he walked home every day. They made him feel like he didn't matter. But what hurt the most was that even the teachers didn't seem to care. They treated Daniel like he was just another face in the crowd, another student who didn't speak up, another boy who kept to himself. They had no idea about the battle Daniel was facing at home, and they didn't know how he was carrying the weight of his father's trial on his small shoulders. Despite all of this, Daniel had learned to live in the shadows. He had learned to be quiet, to keep his thoughts to himself, and to survive in a world that didn't seem to care about him. He kept his head down, focused on the small things that made him happy, like reading books or drawing in his notebook. Those were his escape, his way of finding peace in a world that felt so overwhelming. But in the courtroom, things were different. Here, Daniel wasn't just the son of a man accused of a crime. He was a part of something much bigger. The courtroom was full of powerful people, lawyers, judges, and witnesses, all looking at the case with sharp eyes. The tension in the room was thick, like a storm waiting to break. Everyone had their own idea of what was happening, but no one knew the whole truth. Daniel could feel the tension in the air. It wasn't just about his father's trial, it was about everything. The way people whispered behind their hands, exchanging glances when they thought no one was watching. The way the judge, a stern woman with glasses perched at the tip of her nose, seemed to dismiss his father's pleas for justice. Judge Richardson was tough, and while she didn't show it on her face, Daniel could tell she was already thinking about the case's outcome. She had seen so many cases like this before, and it seemed like she had already decided what the result would be. She hardly paid attention to the things that Jason West had to say. It was like his father's words didn't matter at all. It wasn't just the judge or the lawyer who treated Daniel like he was invisible. It was everyone. People seemed to forget he was even there. His classmates, the ones who bullied him at school, didn't understand the full weight of his father's case. They didn't know what it felt like to have their family torn apart by accusations. They didn't know how it felt to see your father in a courtroom, fighting for his life, while the world around you judged him. But they didn't care. To them, Daniel was just a shy boy with no voice. Every day at school, Daniel walked the halls with his head down, avoiding the snickers and jokes that followed him. "Nobody's son," they would whisper as he passed by. Daniel didn't even try to defend himself anymore. He had learned that it was easier to let the words bounce off him, to ignore the laughter and the stares. He tried not to let it hurt, but sometimes, it did. Sometimes, it made him feel like he didn't belong anywhere. But in the courtroom, things were different. Daniel had a purpose here. He didn't know what that purpose was yet, but he felt it deep inside him. Every time he sat in the back of the room, listening to the arguments, watching the lawyers and the judge, he could feel something stirring inside of him. He wasn't just sitting here as a child, he was a witness to the truth. And he knew that truth had a way of finding its way to the surface, even if it had to break through walls of lies and secrets. The lawyer defending his father, Mr. Harris, was doing his best, but Daniel could tell he was getting tired. Mr. Harris was a good lawyer, but he seemed to be fighting a losing battle. His arguments lacked power, and he didn't have the confidence that the prosecutor, Mr. Richards, had. Mr. Richards was loud and sure of himself, and his words struck with the force of a hammer. He was convinced that Daniel's father was guilty, and he didn't care who knew it. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he watched Mr. Richards speak. The prosecutor was smug, his every word laced with certainty. He spoke as though the case had already been decided, as though there was no way Jason West could be innocent. It made Daniel's blood boil. How could anyone be so sure of something without even knowing the truth? Daniel didn't trust Mr. Richards. He didn't trust anyone in this courtroom. It wasn't that he thought they were all bad people. He just knew that they didn't see things the way he did. They couldn't see the small details, the things that didn't add up. They couldn't see the truth hiding in plain sight. Every day, Daniel watched the trial unfold. And every day, he felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. He knew that his father was innocent, but no one seemed to believe him. The evidence was all stacked against Jason West, and the more Daniel listened, the more he realized that no one was really looking for the truth. They were just looking for a reason to end the case. They wanted a quick decision, and they were willing to ignore anything that didn't fit the story they had already decided on. Daniel was frustrated. He wanted to stand up and shout the truth to the world. He wanted to tell everyone in that room what he knew, what he had learned, what he had seen. But he couldn't. He was just a boy, and his voice didn't matter. Or so he thought. As the days went by, Daniel's resolve grew stronger. He wasn't going to let his father be found guilty of something he didn't do. He wasn't going to let the lies take over the truth. Daniel had been living in the shadows for so long, but now he was ready to step out. He wasn't going to let the world walk all over him. His mind was sharp, and he could see things others missed. He had learned to observe, to pick up on the small things that everyone else ignored. He had learned to read people's faces, to see through their words. Daniel was ready to find the truth. He was ready to do whatever it took to save his father. But how could a 12-year-old boy stand up against a room full of adults who already believed they knew the truth? For weeks, Daniel sat quietly, observing. The courtroom had become a place where he felt both out of place and oddly at home. At first, he had been scared and unsure, a 12-year-old boy in a sea of adults. But slowly, as the days passed, Daniel learned to listen closely. He watched everything: how people acted, how they spoke, how they looked at each other. It wasn't just about the trial anymore. It was about understanding what was happening behind the scenes, what no one else seemed to notice. The defense lawyer, Mr. Harris, had tried his best, but Daniel could tell he wasn't passionate about his job. Every argument seemed weak. Mr. Harris seemed tired, like he had given up before he even started. He spoke in a quiet voice, as though he didn't believe in his own words. Daniel didn't understand all the legal terms, but he could see the lack of fire in the lawyer's eyes. It was like he wasn't even trying to win. And then there was the prosecutor, Mr. Richards. He spoke with confidence, but his words felt cruel, harsh, and unfair. Daniel didn't like the way Mr. Richards would smile when he said something that made his father look guilty. That smile didn't seem real. It felt like Mr. Richards was enjoying his power over everyone in the room, especially his father. Every time he spoke, Daniel could feel the weight of his words. But what Daniel couldn't understand was why Mr. Richards was so sure his father was guilty. He had seen his father's kindness, his honesty. Why didn't anyone else see that? But it wasn't just the drama of the courtroom that caught Daniel's attention. One day, something unexpected happened. It was a normal afternoon during a short break, and the room was filled with murmurs as people stood and stretched. Daniel was sitting quietly, watching the room, when something caught his eye. A notebook, one of the prosecution team members had left behind, had slipped out from under the table. It wasn't just any notebook, it was a large, thick book filled with pages of notes. It seemed like a mistake, but to Daniel, it felt like something much more important. His heart began to race. He wasn't sure why, but he had a strong feeling that this was no accident. He knew something was off. The notebook had been carelessly left behind, almost as if it had been forgotten. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that it was there for a reason. Maybe it had been dropped on purpose. When no one was looking, Daniel slowly made his way to the table where the notebook had fallen. His fingers brushed the cover, and he pulled it gently toward him. The pages were full of scribbles, messy handwriting, and notes that didn't make sense to him at first. But Daniel was a good observer. He had spent years paying attention to small details, watching people closely to understand them. Now, he used that skill to read through the notebook. At first, it seemed like random thoughts and ideas, notes about the trial, and possible strategies. But then, as Daniel turned more pages, he began to notice something strange. Some of the notes were in the margins hidden, almost as though they were meant to be overlooked. Words like corruption, manipulation, and shady deal appeared on the pages, followed by names Daniel didn't recognize. His heart pounded faster. These weren't normal notes for a trial. These were secrets, things that shouldn't have been written down. Daniel's fingers trembled as he turned the pages. He didn't know what he was looking at, but he knew it was important. Someone was trying to hide the truth, and this notebook was a key to uncovering it. The more he read, the more he realized that the case against his father wasn't just weak, it was fabricated. This wasn't just a trial about guilt or innocence, it was about something much bigger. Someone had planted false evidence, and Daniel was beginning to see how far the lies went. There were names of people who weren't even involved in the case, strange connections between them, and notes that seemed to suggest that the case had been decided before the trial even began. Daniel's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about his father. This was about something much darker, something that could ruin more than just one family. But there was no time to think about that. His father's trial was nearing its end, and the days were flying by. Daniel could feel the pressure mounting. The trial was going to end soon, and no one would listen to him. He was just a 12-year-old boy. No one would believe that he had uncovered something so important. People would laugh. They would call him crazy. They would tell him to stay in the background, where he belonged. Still, Daniel knew what he had to do. He couldn't let the truth stay hidden. His father didn't deserve to be punished for something he didn't do. Daniel felt a deep sense of responsibility, like it was up to him to fix everything. The adults around him might have been blind to the truth, but Daniel wasn't. He had seen what others had missed, and he was determined to make sure that the truth came to light. Each day, after school, Daniel would sneak off to his secret spot under the old oak tree in the park. It was his safe place, away from the world. The thick branches of the tree provided him with shade, and the soft grass beneath him felt like a small piece of peace in his chaotic life. There, with the notebook spread out in front of him, Daniel began to piece together the puzzle. The more he read, the more he understood. It was hard work, reading all the messy notes and scribbles. But Daniel was patient. He had always been good at paying attention to small details, and now those details were adding up. Slowly, the truth began to reveal itself to him. The corruption was deeper than he had ever imagined. Powerful people were involved in this case, people who had their own reasons for making sure his father was found guilty. But Daniel didn't know how to stop them. He was just a kid. How could he possibly take on people who had so much power? The lawyer, the judge, the prosecutor, they were all in on it, and they were all too powerful for him to stand against. Still, Daniel refused to give up. He was learning more with every page of the notebook. Each clue was a step closer to the truth. But the clock was ticking. His father's trial was coming to a close, and if Daniel didn't act fast, it would be too late. The pressure was building. Daniel knew he couldn't do it alone. But he also knew that if he didn't act now, he would lose his father forever. As he sat under the oak tree, his mind raced. He had to find a way to make the world see the truth. But how could a 12-year-old boy take down an entire system of lies? The more Daniel read, the more his heart sank. Each page in the notebook felt like a key unlocking a new door, revealing a dark and twisted world behind the courtroom. It was as if the truth was hidden behind a veil, and Daniel was the only one who could lift it. But the deeper he went, the harder it became to believe what he was reading. His mind raced with questions. How could something like this happen? How could his father be accused of such a terrible crime when everything in Daniel's gut told him his father was innocent? He read through more of the notes, trying to make sense of the pieces. The names in the margins started to repeat. Some of them were well-known businessmen, people with a lot of power. There were notes about meetings that had taken place long before the trial even started. These weren't the notes of a prosecutor trying to find the truth. No, these were the notes of someone who was determined to make sure the trial ended in one specific way: guilty. Daniel's mind raced as he thought about all the people who had worked against his father. The judge, too, had been acting strangely, as if she already knew the outcome of the case before it even started. Daniel had noticed her dismissive attitude toward his father's defense lawyer, Mr. Harris. It wasn't just indifference, it was almost like she was eager to see his father convicted. But why? Why would anyone want to frame his father for something he didn't do? It didn't make sense. Daniel knew his father had always been a good man. He had never broken the law in his life. He worked hard every day, did his best to provide for Daniel, and loved him with all his heart. But now, Daniel was staring at a mountain of lies, and no one else seemed to care. As the days passed, Daniel became more determined. He couldn't sit back and do nothing. His father was counting on him. And even though Daniel was just a kid, he felt a sense of duty that he couldn't ignore. The pressure was overwhelming, but he knew he had no choice. He couldn't let this case end without showing the truth. He couldn't let the lies win. The notebook was now full of secrets, pieces of the puzzle that, when put together, would reveal the truth. Daniel had seen enough to know that the trial wasn't just about finding justice. It was about something much darker, something that no one could have imagined. There were people behind the scenes, pulling strings, making sure his father's name would be ruined forever. Daniel didn't know what to do with the notebook. He couldn't bring it to anyone. No one would believe him. They would laugh at him, tell him he was just a child, and send him back to the corner where he belonged. But the notebook was his only weapon, and he had to use it. He had to make sure that the truth came out before it was too late. One day, after school, Daniel went straight to his secret spot under the oak tree. He had been carrying the notebook with him everywhere he went, hiding it in his backpack, keeping it close as though it were the last piece of evidence in a treasure hunt. He sat on the grass, opened the notebook, and began to read again. The more Daniel read, the more he realized how much danger his father was in. The prosecutor, Mr. Richards, was at the center of it all. He had worked behind the scenes to make sure the trial went a certain way. There were even notes about false evidence that had been planted. False evidence that was now being used to make his father appear guilty. Daniel felt a cold shiver run down his spine. This wasn't just about a few bad decisions. This was a plan to ruin his father's life. Daniel couldn't believe what he was reading. How could someone do this? How could they lie so much and get away with it? But the notebook also gave Daniel hope. It showed him that there was a way to stop this, a way to make sure the truth came out. It wasn't going to be easy. In fact, it was going to be the hardest thing he had ever done. But Daniel was no stranger to hard work. He had spent his whole life being overlooked, being underestimated. Now, it was his time to prove everyone wrong. For hours, Daniel sat under the tree, carefully studying every detail in the notebook. He wrote down the names, the meetings, the clues that pointed to the conspiracy. He was creating his own map, his own trail that would lead him to the truth. But each new piece of information only made him more afraid. What if he was wrong? What if it was all just a misunderstanding? What if he couldn't stop it? But Daniel knew he couldn't stop now. He had come too far. His father needed him. He had to act. The next day, Daniel went back to the courtroom. The trial was nearing its final stages, and Daniel could feel the tension in the air. People were starting to talk more, their whispers growing louder as the days went by. His father's defense lawyer, Mr. Harris, had started to look more desperate, his arguments weaker. The prosecutor, Mr. Richards, seemed to be enjoying every moment, every step closer to his victory. Daniel sat in the back of the room, just like he always did, but today was different. Today, he had a plan. He wasn't just going to sit there and watch. He was going to make sure the truth came out. But how could a 12-year-old boy stand up in the middle of a courtroom full of powerful adults? How could he get anyone to listen? He didn't have the answers yet, but he knew he couldn't give up. The notebook was full of lies and secrets, but it was also full of the truth. The truth that no one wanted to hear. And it was up to Daniel to make sure it was heard. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Daniel stood there, his small figure almost lost among the towering adults. His heart was pounding in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears, but he forced himself to stay calm. The notebook was heavy in his hands, but he knew it was his only chance. The weight of it wasn't just the pages inside, it was the weight of everything he had learned, everything he had uncovered over the past weeks. His father's fate rested on these pages, and now it was time for the truth to come to light. The judge, still in shock at the sight of Daniel standing there, looked over at the prosecution. "What is this? What does the boy think he's doing?" she asked, her voice cutting through the silence. Daniel's father, sitting just a few feet away, looked as stunned as everyone else. His lawyer, Mr. Harris, had his mouth open in disbelief, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. Daniel could feel the eyes of everyone on him, but he focused on one person, the judge. He had to make her understand. He had to make her see the truth. "I have proof," Daniel repeated, his voice a little stronger now. He opened the notebook slowly, each page flipping with a soft rustle, like a whisper in the air. He found the page he was looking for, the one that had all the names, the meetings, and the secret deals. He placed it on the table, the words staring up at everyone. The prosecutor, Mr. Richards, stood up quickly, his face turning red. "What is this? A child trying to play detective?" His voice was dripping with contempt. He walked toward Daniel, trying to intimidate him, but Daniel stood his ground. He didn't flinch. He couldn't. "This is more than just a story," Daniel said, his voice clear and steady. "This is the truth. The truth that no one wanted you to see." The room was silent now. No one spoke. Daniel could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, but he ignored it. He looked at Mr. Richards, then at the judge, and then at everyone in the room. He didn't care if they didn't believe him at first. He knew they had to. "Look at the notes," Daniel continued, his fingers trembling slightly as he pointed to the pages. "These meetings, these were set up long before the trial. The prosecutor, Mr. Richards, and these businessmen, they made plans. They decided what was going to happen before it even started." Daniel paused, letting his words sink in. The courtroom remained eerily quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath. He could see the confusion in the eyes of the people sitting in the front row, and he could feel the growing tension as they tried to make sense of what he was saying. But Daniel knew the truth couldn't be ignored anymore. His father's lawyer, Mr. Harris, took a hesitant step forward, peering at the pages Daniel had laid out. His voice cracked as he spoke, almost as if he wasn't sure he believed it yet. This is real." Daniel nodded, his eyes never leaving the judge's face. "It's all here. The evidence that shows my father is innocent." The prosecutor set him up. They planted false evidence to make him look guilty. They wanted him out of the way, and they did everything they could to make that happen. The judge remained silent, staring at the pages. Her glasses perched on the tip of her nose, she seemed lost in thought. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating, and Daniel could feel every second stretching out, like time itself was waiting to see what would happen next. And then, slowly, the judge spoke, her voice low and cautious. "If what you're saying is true, this changes everything. But we cannot jump to conclusions without examining this evidence." Daniel didn't wait. He couldn't. His father's life was at stake, and he had already waited too long. "Examine it," he said, his voice firm. "I'm not the only one who saw it. There are witnesses, people who can confirm everything. They just need to be brave enough to speak up." The prosecutor, now sweating, stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "This is preposterous," he said, trying to cover his nervousness. "A child standing up in court, making wild accusations, it's ridiculous." But Daniel wasn't intimidated. He had seen enough to know that the truth was on his side. "It's not ridiculous," he said. "It's the truth. My father didn't do anything wrong. It was all set up from the beginning." The room seemed to shift. The tension was palpable, and Daniel could feel it in the pit of his stomach. He had said the words, but now he had to make sure they were heard. He had to make sure that everyone in the room understood what he was saying. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a lie that had been building for months, maybe even longer. The judge's eyes never left the pages. She was quiet for a long time, but Daniel could tell she was thinking. Her fingers tapped on the wooden desk, a small sign that she was considering everything that had just happened. The weight of the moment was almost too much for Daniel to bear, but he forced himself to stay calm. And then, finally, the judge spoke again, her voice steady but filled with a new sense of authority. "This is serious," she said. "I will have this examined immediately. If what you say is true, then we have a lot of work to do." Daniel nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling of relief that washed over him. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he had done the right thing. He had stood up when no one else would. He had taken the chance when it seemed impossible. And now, everything was about to change. The room remained silent for a moment longer, as the judge motioned for the bailiff to take the evidence and start the investigation. The prosecutor's face was twisted in anger, but there was nothing he could do now. The truth was out, and Daniel had made sure of it. As the courtroom began to buzz with new energy, Daniel felt his legs shake, but he held his head high. He had done it. He had made sure the truth came to light, and now it was up to everyone else to make sure it was heard. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt like he was no longer invisible. He wasn't just a quiet boy in the back of the room. He was someone who had changed the course of everything. And as the judge gave her orders for the investigation to proceed, Daniel couldn't help but feel a small spark of hope. The battle wasn't over yet, but it had taken a big step toward being won. As the judge ordered the investigation to begin, the tension in the courtroom shifted. The air, once thick with suspicion and disbelief, now hummed with an unfamiliar energy. People began to murmur, their whispers growing louder as the reality of Daniel's revelation began to settle in. They didn't know what to believe, but one thing was clear, this was not just a child making noise. Daniel West had done something no one expected. Daniel, standing at the front of the room with his head held high, felt the weight of the moment pressing on him. His hands, still trembling slightly, were clenched into fists at his sides. He knew that his actions had changed everything, but that didn't make the uncertainty go away. What would happen next? Would the truth be enough to clear his father's name? Or would the forces of corruption continue to work against them, no matter how hard Daniel fought? The judge, her stern face softened by the gravity of the situation, motioned for the courtroom to settle. Her voice echoed in the hushed space. This court will recess for an hour while the evidence presented is thoroughly examined. No one is to leave the building. All parties are instructed to remain in place. Daniel's heart raced as the room began to clear. His father, still sitting at the table, looked at him with a mixture of awe and disbelief. It was as if he couldn't quite grasp what had just happened. Daniel had done it. He had spoken up, and now the world was listening. But what would happen in the next hour? He wasn't sure, but he knew they had to act quickly. They couldn't let the momentum die. Daniel's lawyer, Mr. Harris, approached him, his eyes wide with admiration. "You did it, Daniel," he said quietly, almost in disbelief. I didn't think you'd actually stand up and say something like that. But you did, and now we have a chance." Daniel nodded, but the doubt still lingered in his mind. He had made his move, but what if it wasn't enough? What if the investigation was slow, or if they tried to cover up the truth again? His mind was spinning with possibilities, but one thing remained clear: he couldn't stop now. His father's future, his family's future, depended on it. As the minutes passed, Daniel found a quiet corner in the back of the courtroom, his eyes darting from person to person. He couldn't help but notice the reactions of those around him. The prosecutors were speaking in low, hurried tones, no doubt trying to figure out how to recover from the unexpected turn of events. Mr. Richards, the lead prosecutor, was pacing back and forth, his face flushed with anger. Daniel could see the frustration in his movements, and part of him felt a small sense of satisfaction. For once, the prosecutor wasn't in control. But that satisfaction didn't last long. Daniel's thoughts returned to his father, sitting alone at the table, looking worn and defeated. Despite the glimmer of hope Daniel had given him, his father was still facing an uncertain future. Daniel couldn't rest. Not now. Mr. Harris, having spoken to a few people near the judge's chambers, returned to Daniel's side. "I spoke to some of the court staff," he said, lowering his voice. "They're going to look into it. But we have to be ready for anything. This won't be easy." Daniel nodded again. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that he had done something incredible. He had stood up, and he had made people listen. No matter how it turned out, he would always remember this moment, the moment when he finally had a voice. Time passed slowly as the courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation. The weight of the next steps hung over everyone, but for Daniel, the reality was beginning to set in. He had done more than just speak out. He had given his father a chance. For the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. The doors to the courtroom opened, and a bailiff entered, signaling that it was time to return to the proceedings. The judge had given her orders for the investigation to begin, and now they would all see where it would lead. Daniel walked back to his seat, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room on him. There was no turning back now. His father, seeing Daniel return, gave him a weak smile. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You've done more than I could ever ask for." Daniel smiled back, but the words didn't come. What could he say? The truth was out now. They just had to wait. He had done everything he could. The next steps were out of his hands, and there was nothing he could do but hope that the truth would be enough to save his father. The judge returned to the bench, her face grim but determined. She looked at Daniel, and for the first time since the trial began, she gave a slight nod of approval. The court proceedings resumed, and Daniel sat back in his seat, watching as the investigation began to unfold. He couldn't help but wonder if the truth would be enough to turn the tide. But as the minutes ticked by, one thing became clear: the battle wasn't over yet. The tension in the courtroom continued to rise as the investigation proceeded. It felt like hours before anyone spoke again. The judge reviewed the evidence closely, flipping through the pages of Daniel's notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. The prosecutor stood nearby, still visibly agitated, but there was little he could do now. His carefully constructed case was falling apart, piece by piece. Daniel could feel the eyes of the room on him. He had already done more than anyone had expected. He had exposed the lies that had been hiding in plain sight. He had shown the world what the prosecutor and the powerful businessmen had been trying so hard to keep secret. And now it was up to the judge to make the final decision. The judge cleared her throat, and the courtroom fell silent once more. "I have reviewed the evidence," she said, her voice strong and unwavering. "What you've presented, Daniel West, is not to be taken lightly. There are clear discrepancies in the prosecution's case, and the investigation has uncovered several pieces of critical evidence that were hidden." Daniel's heart leapt in his chest. It was happening. The truth was coming to light, just as he had hoped. The judge turned to the prosecutor, her expression cold and unyielding. "Mr. Richards, it seems your case was built on deception. You have failed to provide the court with honest evidence, and now the truth has been revealed. I am ordering a full investigation into your actions, and I expect the proper authorities to take immediate action." The prosecutor's face went pale. He opened his mouth to argue, but the judge raised her hand, silencing him. "Enough. The damage has been done. Your attempts to cover up the truth will not stand. Daniel West has shown us what was hidden, and now justice will take its course." The moment the judge declared a recess, the air in the courtroom was thick with tension. People stood up, their chairs scraping against the floor as they rushed to see the evidence Daniel had brought forward. The lawyers, too, hurried to the table where Daniel's notebook lay open, filled with the damning evidence that had changed the course of the trial. Daniel stayed seated, trying to steady his breathing. His heart raced with excitement, but his hands shook. He had never expected it to be this intense, but now that it was happening, he couldn't back down. He had done what he needed to do. The truth was now out in the open, and it was up to the judge and the law to decide what came next. His father, still sitting at the table, stared at him with wide eyes, disbelief etched across his face. It was as if he couldn't believe that his son had just changed everything. Daniel could feel his father's gaze on him, but he didn't look back. Instead, he focused on the events unfolding in front of him. The courtroom was in chaos, with people talking in loud voices. The defense lawyer, Mr. Harris, was speaking with the judge in the corner, while the prosecutor, Mr. Richards, stood near the door, looking visibly shaken. His face was pale, and his hands trembled as he tried to grasp the enormity of what had just happened. Daniel could see the fear in the prosecutor's eyes. It was the same fear he had felt when he first realized how deep the corruption ran, how many people had worked together to frame his father. But Daniel wasn't afraid anymore. He had taken his shot, and now he was waiting for the results. The judge called for order, her voice commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "We will take a recess for an hour while the evidence is reviewed," she said. "This court will reconvene shortly, and I expect all parties to remain in place." As the courtroom slowly emptied out, Daniel felt a surge of adrenaline. He could hardly believe what had just happened. He had stood up in front of everyone, presented the truth, and now the case against his father was crumbling. He could hardly wait for the trial to resume. His father, who had been sitting quietly with his head bowed, finally looked up at him. "Daniel," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You did it? You really did it?" Daniel nodded, but he didn't speak. He didn't have the words. For so long, his father had been the one to protect him, to keep him safe from the world. But today, it had been Daniel who had stepped forward and done what no one else had the courage to do. He had fought for the truth, and now his father was free. As they waited for the trial to resume, Daniel couldn't help but notice the changes around him. The people who had once ignored him, who had called him weak and insignificant, were now looking at him with a new respect. It wasn't just the lawyers or the judge. Even the reporters, who had ignored him at the start of the trial, were now whispering about him, their eyes focused on him with curiosity. Daniel felt both proud and overwhelmed. He had never asked for attention, never wanted to be in the spotlight. But now, everything had changed. He had done something that no one had expected from a 12-year-old boy. He had exposed the truth, and now the world would know what had really happened to his father. The trial resumed after what seemed like an eternity. The judge returned to the bench, her expression still stern, but there was something different in the way she looked at Daniel. It was as if she now saw him for what he truly was: brave, determined, and capable of changing the course of history. "Court will reconvene," the judge announced, and the room fell silent once again. "I have reviewed the evidence presented by Daniel West, and I have consulted with the necessary parties. It is clear that the prosecution's case was built on lies and manipulation. The truth has been revealed, and I will not allow this miscarriage of justice to continue." The prosecutor, who had been standing near the door, took a step forward. "Your Honor," he said, his voice faltering, this is all a mistake. I don't know where that notebook came from, but it's not real." The judge raised her hand, silencing him. "I have seen enough," she said firmly. "Your actions have been exposed, Mr. Richards. You have attempted to deceive this court and manipulate the truth for your own gain. Your career as a prosecutor ends here." The prosecutor's face went from pale to red in an instant. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. He knew he was defeated. The evidence was overwhelming. The truth was out, and there was no escaping it. "Bailiff," the judge continued, "please escort Mr. Richards out of the courtroom. He will face charges for his role in this conspiracy." The bailiff, a large man with a stern expression, moved swiftly to the prosecutor's side and motioned for him to leave. The prosecutor, his face contorted with anger and disbelief, was led out of the courtroom. As he passed Daniel, his eyes locked onto the young boy, but Daniel didn't flinch. He had done his part, and now the consequences were playing out. The judge turned her attention back to Daniel's father, who was still sitting at the table, his hands resting on the surface as if he couldn't believe what was happening. "Mr. West," the judge said, her voice now calm and compassionate, "based on the new evidence, and after a thorough review of the facts, this court finds you not guilty of all charges." The words hit Daniel's father like a wave. He blinked, his face frozen in disbelief. For a moment, it seemed as if he couldn't process what was happening. He had been fighting for his freedom for so long, and now, it was finally happening. He was free. The judge nodded to the bailiff, who stepped forward and removed the handcuffs from Daniel's father's wrists. The chains that had bound him for so long were gone, and for the first time in years, he stood tall and free. Daniel's heart swelled with pride. His father was free. The man who had been accused of a crime he didn't commit, the man who had been wrongfully imprisoned, was now exonerated. And it was all because of Daniel. The courtroom was silent, but the silence was filled with a sense of relief and awe. The people who had been sitting in judgment, the ones who had doubted Daniel, were now looking at him with respect. They couldn't deny what he had done. He had shown them all that even the quietest, most overlooked person could change the course of history. Daniel turned to his father, who was standing beside him now, a smile slowly spreading across his face. "We did it, Dad," Daniel said softly. His father placed a hand on his shoulder, pulling him into a tight embrace. "No, Daniel. You did it. You saved me." Daniel didn't know what to say. He had done more than save his father. He had changed everything. He had exposed the truth and brought justice where there was none. The judge spoke again, her voice carrying across the courtroom. "Let it be known that this court will not tolerate corruption, and justice will always prevail, no matter who stands in its way." With that, the gavel came down, signaling the end of the trial. The case was closed, and justice had been served. Daniel stood at the back of the courtroom, watching as his father shook hands with the lawyer and thanked the judge. It was over. The nightmare that had haunted their family for so long was finally over. But as Daniel watched the people around him, he realized something important. It wasn't just his father who had been set free. It was their whole family. Their reputation, their future, it had all been restored because Daniel had had the courage to do the right thing. As they left the courthouse together, Daniel felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't just about winning the case. It was about knowing that no matter how small or invisible you might feel, you can always make a difference. Sometimes, the quietest voice is the one that speaks the loudest. And Daniel West had proved that, without a doubt. As Daniel and his father stepped out of the courthouse, the bright sunlight seemed almost blinding after the long hours spent in the dark, tense courtroom. The air felt different now, lighter, freer. They had done it. His father was no longer a man falsely accused, but a man who had been cleared of all charges, thanks to his son's courage and determination. The world outside seemed to stretch endlessly before them, filled with new possibilities. His father, still in disbelief, placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder as they walked toward their car. His fingers rested there with a tenderness that Daniel could feel deep inside. "I've never been prouder of anyone in my life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved me, Daniel. You saved our family. You brought us back to the light." Daniel didn't answer right away. He didn't know what to say. It wasn't that he didn't feel proud, or that he didn't understand what had happened. It was just that all of it felt so surreal. A few days ago, they had been on the edge of losing everything, and now his father was free, the charges against him had been dropped, and their family was no longer under the weight of those false accusations. But Daniel knew one thing for sure. There was something bigger than all of this, something that went beyond the case or the courthouse or even the people who had tried to tear their lives apart. It was the truth, the power of knowing that sometimes, the quietest voice is the one that carries the most weight. And in that silence, in that calm determination, you could change everything. They reached their car, and Daniel climbed into the passenger seat. His father started the engine, and for a few moments, they drove in silence. It wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't even strange. It was just a peaceful quiet, one that filled the space between them with understanding. They both knew that their lives would never be the same again. They had fought, and they had won. As they drove through the streets, Daniel couldn't help but think about everything that had led to this moment. He thought about the times at school when no one noticed him, when the other kids ignored him or made fun of him for being shy. He thought about the whispers behind his back, the way people had looked at him like he was invisible. But now, the world had seen him. He had stepped forward and changed everything, not by shouting or making a scene, but by quietly standing up for what was right. He smiled to himself, remembering how it felt to sit in that courtroom, watching the prosecutor squirm as the truth was revealed. He had known all along that he was doing the right thing. He hadn't been sure how it would turn out, but he knew that he had to try. And when the notebook had fallen into his hands, he had known that he couldn't let the chance slip away. It wasn't just about helping his father anymore. It was about doing what was right, no matter how big or small the person was, or how much they were underestimated. Daniel turned to his father, who was still driving, his hands steady on the wheel. "Dad," Daniel said quietly, his voice full of conviction. "I didn't do this for me. I did it for us. For you. For our family. For the truth." His father nodded, his eyes softening as he glanced over at him. "And I'll never forget it, Daniel. You've shown me what real strength is. It's not about being loud or powerful. It's about doing what's right, even when no one expects you to. You proved that." They were getting close to home now, and Daniel felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had always believed in doing what was right, but now he truly understood the weight of those words. Sometimes, you don't have to be the loudest person in the room to make an impact. Sometimes, it's the quiet ones, the ones who are overlooked, who can change the world in ways no one expects. When they reached home, Daniel's mother was waiting for them on the front steps, her face bright with anticipation. She had been there for every step of the journey, supporting them both in the background. She had always believed in Daniel, even when no one else did. As Daniel stepped out of the car and walked toward her, he felt a rush of emotion. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into a tight hug. "I knew you could do it," she whispered, her voice full of pride. Daniel hugged her back, holding on for a moment longer than usual. He had done it. He had saved his father, and in doing so, he had saved their family. He had proven to everyone that sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the most power. They all went inside together, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Daniel felt at peace. There were no more whispers, no more accusations, no more fear. The weight had been lifted, and now their family could finally begin to heal. Later that night, after dinner, Daniel sat quietly in his room, reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about the people who had underestimated him, who had ignored him because of his quiet nature. He thought about the prosecutor, who had been so confident that he could win, so certain that Daniel didn't have the power to stop him. And he thought about the judge, who had listened to his words and seen the truth for what it was. She had recognized that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is speak the truth, even when it's hard. Daniel closed his eyes and let out a slow breath. The world hadn't changed overnight, but it had changed for him and his family. And for that, he was grateful. As he lay in bed, he thought about what his father had said to him earlier: "You saved our family. You brought us back to the light." Daniel smiled to himself, knowing that the real victory wasn't just the case or the courtroom, it was the realization that sometimes, the quietest voice is the one that can move mountains. And in that quiet voice, Daniel had found his power. Sometimes, the world tells us that we have to be loud and bold to make a difference. It tells us that only the biggest, the strongest, or the most confident voices can change the world. But Daniel West proved that the quietest person, the one who is often overlooked or dismissed, can hold the most power. When the world underestimates you, when they think you're too small or too shy to make a difference, that's when you have the chance to surprise them. That's when you have the power to speak up, to stand tall, and to do what's right. Daniel's story is a reminder that courage doesn't always come with a loud voice. Sometimes, it comes in the form of quiet determination, the strength to act when others think you can't, and the willingness to do what's right even when it seems impossible. And in the end, it's not about how loud you are. It's about the truth you carry and the courage to speak it, no matter how small or quiet you may seem.